And we're live.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alex Williams. I'm the chair of the Commission to Restore Trust in Policing. Welcome to our meeting this afternoon. I will say this is our fourth meeting since resuming our activities that were previously suspended due to the pandemic. Now, just a note before we get started, the Commission plans on adjourning on or around 4 o'clock today in order to accommodate a scheduling conflict. At our last meeting, the Commission began to discuss its recommendations for the final report, which we're working on right now. Today, we plan to continue those discussions. But first, the Commission will interview former Baltimore Police Department Deputy Commissioner Dean Palmier. So I would now ask the counsel to the Commission, Peter Keith and Megan Casey, will you all begin the interview of Mr. Palmier? The commissioners will have the opportunity to ask follow-up questions after the council have completed their portions of the interview. So with that, Mr. Keith, Ms. Casey, I now defer to you.
Thank you, Your Honor, Mr. Chairman. I would ask Mr. Lecter of Veritex to swear the witness if we could, please.
All right, Mr. Palmier, can you raise your right hand, please?
Mm-hmm.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you give today will be the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Lecter. And Mr. Palmier, I would note for the record that we sent you a letter requesting your appearance and then didn't hear back from you. We issued a subpoena, but shortly after you were served, I got a call from Legal Affairs at BPD, who also talked with Ms. Casey, confirming that you did want to cooperate with us and that the delay in getting back to us was their fault, not yours. So I want to start by expressing my appreciation for your appearance today. Let's begin with a little bit about your background. I know you spent your career at the Baltimore Police Department. Can you give us just sort of a 2-minute overview of your service at BPD, what positions you held and how long you were there?
Yes, sir. I started as a police cadet in June of 1990, right after graduating from high school. While I was a police cadet, I served in the communications section, the central records section, and the homicide section. When I was eligible to go to the police academy, I went into the police academy. Upon graduating the police academy, I was assigned to Northern District Patrol, then transferred to Southeast District Patrol, and ultimately went to what was the Quick Response Team, or now known as the SWAT Team. From there, I was promoted to sergeant, assigned to the Eastern District for a period of time. Was detailed to the East Side Initiative for a period of time, went back to Quick Response Team as a sergeant. I was promoted out of there to lieutenant and went to the Firearms Apprehension Strike Team for a period of time, which ultimately evolved, I believe, into the Organized Crime Division, and then became the Violent Crimes Impact Division. I was promoted to Deputy Major, which is equivalent to a captain now. Stayed at the Violent Crimes Impact Division, was ultimately promoted to Major and transferred to the Central District as the commanding officer for a period of time, and then went back to the Violent Crimes Impact Division and became a colonel. Stayed there until I was promoted to Deputy Commissioner. As the Deputy Commissioner, I served in the Neighborhood Patrol Bureau, Criminal Investigation Bureau, and depending on the administration at the time, sometimes I was serving as both, overseeing Patrol Bureau and Criminal Investigations Bureau, which was known at the time as the Operations Bureau. It's kind of the Reader's Digest.
And so you basically served at BPD then for, what was it, 28 years continuously?
Yes, sir.
And worked throughout the city?
Yes, sir.
And for how many years were you deputy?
I believe around 5 years, 4.5, 5 years.
And this would have been both under former Commissioner Batts and then under former Commissioner Davis as well.
Yes, sir.
And you retired in 2018, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And what are you doing now, sir?
Working at a gun range.
As part of your work at BPD, were you involved in narcotics enforcement
Yes, sir.
and supervising plainclothes officers who were involved with regard to drugs and money and guns arrests?
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you this question early on, Mr. Palmier. As you know, Officer Jenkins and the other officers who were affiliated with the GTTF were indicted in March of 2017. And prior to those indictments, did you have any knowledge that any of those officers had engaged in any criminal misconduct while they were working at BPD?
No, sir.
And I can give you the list of names if you need them. But I just want to make sure for the record that you were not aware of any criminal misconduct by any of those officers at the time they were indicted.
No, sir.
And that includes conduct like stealing money or unlawful stops or seizures or making false statements in search and seizure applications or planting evidence or overtime fraud. None of that misbehavior had come to your attention as deputy as of the time that those officers were indicted?
No, sir.
Prior to the officers being indicted, were you aware that there was a federal investigation of the GTTF?
No, sir.
And when did you become first aware of that?
I believe it was several days before they were indicted. Commissioner Davis at the time informed me that there was an indictment pending for members of the Violent Crime Impact Section, but I did not know who at the time.
And after each of those officers were indicted, did you have any conversations with any of them?
No, sir.
Either about the charges or how to handle the charges?
No, sir.
Have you talked with any of them since they've been prosecuted and convicted?
No, sir.
Let's talk a little bit about Wayne Jenkins. Prior to the time he was indicted, how frequently did you interact with Officer Jenkins?
Very seldom.
And how would you describe your relationship with him?
I didn't have a personal relationship with him. I knew who he was. He worked in my chain of command, but I didn't have a personal relationship with Wayne Jenkins.
And what was your perception of him as an officer before he was indicted?
He was known as an officer who would be so-called a go-getter. He, at the time, appeared respected by his first-line supervisors, but I didn't have really a personal relationship with him to know too much about him. In fact, I don't know what districts he worked or where he came from prior to coming into the Violent Crime Impact Section.
And when you say he had a reputation as a go-getter, would that be based on numbers of arrests or numbers of guns seized, basically his performance metrics?
You could say that, yes, sir.
And was it your understanding that he was a high achiever, at least from the perspective of how many arrests he made and how many guns he got off the street?
I'm not sure what you mean by high achiever, but you would often see emails that come out from his squad about gun seizures through interdepartmental mail.
Yes, we've subpoenaed records for BPD, and we've seen a number of those emails, and I also saw some in which you would praise him for his performance when he would send out those emails, basically saying excellent work or good job. Was that part of your typical practice when you learned that officers under your chain of command were actively involved in making arrests or seizing guns?
I don't recall those emails, but yes, sir. I mean, at times we would praise that work. Yes, sir.
Did Officer Jenkins ever go around chain of command and ask you personally for any favors or equipment or anything special that he thought would be helpful to him in doing his work?
Not that I recall directly, no, sir.
Do you recall assigning a Chevy Impala to him around Christmas time of 2015?
He was assigned a Chevy Impala, yes, sir. But his colonel at the time had asked me about vehicles, if they could get vehicles, additional vehicles.
The colonel at the time was Sean Miller,
Yes, sir.
and this would have been a city-owned car that Officer Jenkins was allowed to use personally?
Not personally, it was for work-related business.
Was it typical for sergeants to be assigned vehicles like that?
Their squads would be assigned vehicles, yes, sir.
Do you recall authorizing a push bumper for Officer Jenkins at one point for his vehicle?
No, sir.
Do you have any idea why Officer Jenkins would need a push bumper or want a push bumper?
I do not know, sir.
Any other special equipment requests at all that you would recall of Officer Jenkins?
Not that I recall, sir, no.
Did you ever reach out to him directly, either for a special assignment or to perform overtime at any particular point in time when you felt like you needed an aggressive officer to handle a particular situation?
Not that I recall, no.
Were you ever involved in, or did you ever become aware of any internal investigations of Officer Jenkins before he was indicted? Any IA investigations or charges in which you were involved?
Not that I recall, sir, no.
Did you ever have any discussions with anyone in the senior command, either any of the commissioners or former deputy commissioners, about any internal affairs charges involving Officer Jenkins?
Not that I recall, no, sir.
And let me ask you about some of the other gun trace task force defendants. I won't go through the whole list, but do you know Keith Gladstone?
Yes, sir.
And what was your interaction with Sergeant Gladstone?
Pretty much the same. I knew he worked in the old criminal investigation division narcotics prior to the organized crime division coming about. I knew he was he worked the Eastern District at some point, but again, I didn't know him as a personal friend or off-duty relationship.
And what was your perception of Gladstone as an officer?
From my understanding, he was known as a well-known drug officer, narcotics officer, who would often seize large quantities when he was in the old narcotics section of the police department. I did not work in that section, but you would hear his name frequently when it was associated to narcotics seizures.
And how about Daniel Herschel? Did you have interaction with Officer Herschel?
Yes, sir. I knew Daniel Herschel.
And what was your interaction with him?
He, again, worked the Eastern District for a while. I believe when I may have been sergeant there, if that's the first time I really interacted with him. But again, not on a personal level, or it was a business related level.
Mm-hmm. And Sergeant Thomas Allers, did you know Sergeant Allers?
Yes, sir.
And what was your interaction with him?
Again, he had worked in the FAST unit, is where I first met him when I was a lieutenant in FAST. I think he came out of the Southern District prior to that. At one point, he did work back in my office while I was, I believe, colonel, along with my administrative staff, and was promoted out of there.
Did you, when you were serving as deputy, commissioner, did you ever have concerns that any of these officers, and I'm talking about now Jenkins, Gladstone, Herschel, Allers, or any of the other officers who were ultimately convicted, did you ever have any concerns that any of those officers were just not credible in connection with their work?
Not personally, no, sir. Again, even some of the things that I read about after the fact, after the indictments regarding their IA backgrounds, I was not aware of at all. So I was quite surprised by the length of some of their frequency with internal affairs, so to speak.
Mhm. And did you ever have any concerns that any of these officers were engaging in activities that were not proper law enforcement, stopping people without suspicion, arresting people without probable cause, falsifying search and seizure affidavits? And anything like that ever come to your attention, ever percolate up to you in your role as deputy?
No, sir.
Were you involved at all in assigning Officer Jenkins to head the gun trace task force in 2016?
Not that I recall. I mean, involved, ultimately, we have to sign the transfer requests, but generally, the decisions are made by first line supervisors, majors, colonels, as to who they're selecting for those units.
Do you know who made that decision?
I don't recall, no, sir.
Do you know who made the decision to transfer Officer Herschel over to Officer Jenkins' squad?
No, sir, I don't recall.
Do you know who made the decision to transfer Officers Ward, Hendricks, and Taylor to Officer Jenkins' squad?
No, sir.
After the indictments became public, were you involved in any investigation within the police department to try to figure out how all of this happened?
No, sir. That would be one of my recommendations moving forward. This is an unfortunate opportunity, but it should be a learning experience, a training experience, after action critique that can be incorporated into academy curriculum and training of, particularly with supervisors, first line supervisors.
And I appreciate that. I'm trying to understand whether factually, after these indictments became public in 2017, whether you were involved at all in any kind of after action critique or root cause analysis or investigation to try to figure out how it was that there were so many officers involved in misconduct that they were either convicted of or pled guilty to, and how it had happened for so many years without the department having detected it.
I don't recall being involved in that. No, sir.
Do you recall any discussions at all at the command level about such an investigation or what should be done to try to figure this out?
I'm sure those discussions were had. I simply don't recall, who or when or what was actually talked about, but we were obviously appalled and shocked at that. And, it never came to fruition to make that a learning experience. I don't recall after action critique, that I was personally involved in to the extent of digging into how that happened.
Were you personally shocked and appalled when you heard about the charges against these officers?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Can you describe for us what your reaction was, how you felt, why you found it offensive?
Well, I come from a family of law enforcement officers that served in Baltimore for many years, and I take a lot of pride in the Baltimore Police Department, what it stands for, and most appalling is the victims in this, that were victimized as a result of their actions. It's disgusting to me because I am proud of my profession, and I think as we look at the environment we live in today with law enforcement and the distrust between the community and law enforcement, this just compounds it tenfold. And, no one should be victimized in that capacity by somebody that's there to uphold the law and instill trust in communities.
After the charges were announced, from that period of time in March of 2017 until you retired in February of 2018, which was roughly a year, can you describe for us any changes that occurred within the department, either personnel-wise or system-wise, that it was your understanding was designed to deal with the gun trace task force scandal, address what had happened, and try to keep it from happening again?
Again, my timeline's a little skewed on this, but I do know that at the time, Commissioner Davis disbanded plainclothes units and put everyone back in uniform. Again, we were working with the Department of Justice at the time with not only the gun trace task force, but with the police department as a whole regarding the consent decree and some of the reform measures as it related to the department, updating policies and procedures, things of that nature. But it ultimately would involve what occurred with the gun trace task force, but it was on a larger scale for the department as a whole.
Now we've learned that Colonel Miller was demoted by the commissioner after the indictments became public. Were you aware of that?
Yes, sir.
And were you involved in that decision? Did the commissioner consult with you about that?
He had told me that he made the decision to demote him, yes.
Did you ever discuss with then Colonel Miller, later I guess Lieutenant Miller, what had happened with the GTTF and what his knowledge was about their activities?
Not that I recall, no, sir.
Did you ever speak with the Gun Trace Task Force Lieutenant, Marjorie German, about the charges or her knowledge of what their activities were?
No, sir.
Other than the demotion of Colonel Miller, are you aware of any other personnel actions or changes? You mentioned the disbanding of the plainclothes units. Anything else that you can recall that then Commissioner Davis did?
What they called the district operations units were transformed into what's now known as the district action teams. They're in a modified uniform right now, from as I understand it. But I do remember Commissioner Davis trying to rebrand that, but not specifically. There may have been other things. I just don't recall specifically what we discussed.
You mentioned that what happened with the Gun Trace Task Force creates an opportunity, a learning experience, I believe was your words, from the standpoint of training officers, ethics training. Was any of that implemented during that final year of your service before you retired? Any training modules or emphasis on the misconduct in an effort to teach other officers a lesson so that it wouldn't happen again?
There was quite a bit of reform going on in the department as far as policies and procedures, some things that were automated. Generally, at times when new policies and procedures came out, they were done on a paper format. We were able to get those out electronically, have officers sign that they read and received those policies. Some had videos and questions, test questions that they would take as a result. But as far as it concerns specific to the Gun Trace Task Force, there was nothing specific to that. And I think in any of opportunity where misconduct is founded, then the department should start to look at how those incidents occurred and at what junction it occurred. Was this person a criminal before he was even hired, or what state, what part of his career did he decide to take a wrong turn? And if so, why? You know, those discussions were never had that I was a part of.
At the time of the federal trial of Officers Herschel and Taylor, I know you were questioned by the media when one of the officers who pleaded guilty, Mamadou Gandu, testified that he had heard from other people that you had, I think he used the word coached in his trial testimony, that you had coached Officer Jamel Ram regarding how to respond to an internal affairs investigation that had happened, I think back in 2009, an officer-involved shooting of an individual by the name of Sean Cassidy. I believe I've read your comments to the press about that, but did you ever coach Officer Ram or any other officer about how to handle an internal affairs investigation?
Absolutely not. No, sir.
Did you ever speak with Officer Ram about that incident, the officer-involved shooting of Sean Cassidy?
No, sir. In fact, I don't even think I knew who Officer Raham was at that time.
Now, Mr. Palmier, this commission, we're coming toward the end of our service, and we've been grappling with two main questions. The first one is, how did this misconduct happen and continue to happen for so many years, involving so many officers, and not be detected by the department? And then the second question is, how can this commission and the department help ensure that this doesn't happen again, so that we can restore the public's trust in the police department? And I want to walk you through those two questions, and I'd appreciate any thoughts or insights you have about those questions. So with regard to the first question, how did this happen? And this is all public knowledge. We now know that there were at least 13 officers charged criminally, that some of this was organized, that they were acting in teams and in groups, that as you pointed out, law enforcement was becoming criminal, that they were doing this over a period of many years, that it included not just line officers, but squad leaders. We have Sergeants Jenkins, Allers, and Gladstone, all of them involved, all of them pleading guilty, and the department not able to detect it on its own. So in trying to break that question down and get the benefit of your many years of experience and supervisory experience in the department, I mean, can you give us any insights as you look back and think about this as somebody who served as an officer as well as a supervisor? Do you have any insights in terms of how this was able to unfold over the course of many years, and why it was that the department was not able to detect it internally?
I wish I had an answer for that. It's I think it's multiple things. Some of the deficiencies, I think, through the years and changes of administration in a short periods of time causes a little bit of confusion, I guess, when you're redirecting and a new vision. So I think command structure, overall command structure, is important, particularly with specialized units. Oftentimes, even though some worked out of the headquarters building, the majority of the enforcement teams worked out of off-site locations, whether it was other district station houses or off-site locations that the city had for them, causes a misoversight with supervision and command structure. Internal affairs, again, is a big portion of this when you look at vetting these officers or looking for early intervention signs that may have developed that would preclude them from even being accepted into one of those units. Again, just first line supervision training, I think, is important. We did do some sergeants schooling towards the end of my career, where the department was able to structure first line supervisor schools for incoming sergeants. Again, the curriculum would need to be retooled specific to identifying or pinpointing potential corruption within the department. I think how we prevent that moving forward would be an investment into the police department. You know, oftentimes the police department would have funds come in or grant money for crime suppression overtime, things of that nature, where officers would be in neighborhoods that were being plagued by violent behaviors and violent acts. But there was never really an investment in the police department. So placing funds into it and investing into it, in my opinion, is two different things. As the 8th largest police department in the country, you know, they're still in a paper reporting system. The overtime slips are still recorded on a piece of paper and submitted. At least they were when I left. I don't know if any of that's changed. But the technology improvements I know are underway, so to speak. We've tried several technology improvements during my career, but it was always one or the other. We would invest in mobile workstations, but they wouldn't communicate with the CAD system. So you really need to invest in a full infrastructure that communicates with one another. I did mention the early warning system, and then hiring and recruitment. I don't know what that looks like, but I think there's has to be some improvements with candidates that are coming in and how they're vetted and background. Again, prevention. The department does random urinalysis. Maybe you implement random polygraphs, particularly with specialized units that work in task forces or deal with money and narcotics at a larger scale than the average patrol officer does. Going back to the technology piece, I don't know what the legalities are, but looking at your patrol cars, they're city-owned vehicles, you know, having cameras or audio within cars, you know, with the expectation of privacy in city vehicles, I don't know. And we talked about centralized versus decentralized units. You know, there's pros and cons to both of those, but if you're going to decentralize them, then I would recommend that they're assigned to that command that they're decentralized under. And then it's, again, important for the after action critiques. Restoring trust in the community, I think that was the third part of your question.
Yeah, and I guess I was focused initially on just how this happened, and I think.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think you answered the question, and in terms of how to keep it from happening again, yeah, I mean, and I want to focus in some detail on a couple of things you said. So, and I know we've heard this as well from Commissioner Harrison in his general public comments about the GTTF scandal and how to keep it from happening again. And in trying to sort of analyze it, I break it down into 4 different areas. The first is systems of accountability, and that includes, for example, changes to the overtime system, which you mentioned, it going from a paper system to more automated that would keep officers from being able to engage in overtime fraud. I guess too, we have body-worn cameras as an accountability system that didn't exist for many of the years in which the gun trace task force was engaging in criminal misconduct, but has now been fully implemented. You mentioned training, and I'd like to get your impression of ethics training, at least as of the time you left the department, whether you felt that that there actually was strong and effective ethics training at the academy, field training, FTOs, at the supervisory level. I wanted to get your take on that. Again, with the idea that this situation could be used as a training or learning experience for new officers.
Yes, sir. So the training academy fell under a different deputy commissioner. So unfortunately, I didn't have the day-to-day contact to observe that curriculum and how it was taught. But, you know, I would certainly think that what was being taught obviously wasn't enough. So I would definitely consider looking at that particular curriculum and learning what other best practices they are to incorporate into the curriculum, and then reinforce it. I mean, you do learn things when you look back, and you have a moment to decompress, you know, from an agency that's very busy. So, you know, in the perfect world, I think reinforcing ethics training, particularly in the annual in-service curriculum, is important.
Do you recall during your time as deputy whether there was ever criminal misconduct like majestic towing or individual officer misconduct that was then highlighted in either annual ethics training or other training and used as reminders to officers that you need to basically follow the rules, not get in trouble, or you're going to get caught and get punished?
I don't recall. No, sir.
You mentioned polygraphs during your time with the department. Were random polygraphs used for officers involved with drugs and money?
No, sir.
How about integrity stings during your tenure, either as deputy or before when you were in command or even as a street officer? Were you aware of any time periods where integrity stings were used by the department basically to as a deterrent and as a method of detection for officer misconduct?
Yes, sir. Under the Norris administration, he had established an integrity squad that would conduct integrity stings within the department. And often, if I'm not mistaken, there was support from outside agencies to assist in those sting operations. But the department had gotten away from that, and that would be one of my recommendations moving forward, is to reinstate or implement that.
You mentioned changes in administration and command structure. Is that an example of something that a particular commissioner might be in favor of, but then when that commissioner leaves, a new commissioner comes in, different priorities, different thinking, and then we have both a change in organization, a change in administration, and also a change in accountability measures like that?
Yes, sir. During the changes of administration, there's obviously a new vision that comes in. Some things remain the same, while others, you know, you want to improve in other areas, new ideas. A lot of the commissioners obviously communicate with major city chiefs from around the country and to see what's working in their agencies, and you know, some best practices that could be learned that we could implement or potentially implement in our agency. But it all has to be tooled for your specific agency and goal. But there was oftentimes with a new administration would come new ideas, and certain things would be put on a back burner, so to speak, as we push forward with new implementation of, or reorganization, so to speak. And the other thing that's important to note is the attrition rate in the police department often had impact on where you are investing your resources, so to speak. So where internal affairs could be staffed, if the department was staffed properly, you know, oftentimes you pull from different areas within the department to fill other needs, so to speak.
Did you feel during your time at BPD that mean, there was a fairly high turnover of commissioners and change in organizational structure and direction. Do you think, looking back, that was a problem that contributed at all to the GTTF and the officers' behavior?
I don't know if you could make if it would be a problem, if the turnover would be a problem as to what they did, why they did it as the corruption. But I think, with the ethics unit, with integrity stings, would that have had an impact if it was still going on today? If that unit still existed today, I don't know. But the turnover in short periods of time through administrations, obviously causes a little bit of confusion in the department as far as stabilizing the vision for the department and the direction it's going. So when you have turnover, you're recalibrating what we're doing today. And then, that takes time to implement. And by the time you start to make progress on your implementation, you're under a new administration with a new vision.
And would that recalibrating, would that include things like the extent of emphasis on internal affairs and staffing in internal affairs, and emphasis on things like early intervention and staffing and resources for that type of program?
From my experience, I don't believe any of the commissioners disagreed with the importance of internal affairs and early warning systems. The issue came down to implementing it and how it was implemented and the technology costs behind it and the storage fees behind it. So it was one of the things that was talked about often through the administrations. And it was, I believe, under, it might've been under the Bielefeld administration when the very first crack at the early intervention system came about, but it never sustained. And it wasn't because we didn't want it to. It was the fact that it was became a funding issue, and how do we implement it? Very similar to the court matrix system.
You mentioned the possibility of listening devices in cars. Was that ever considered when you were a deputy as a means of detecting officer misbehavior?
No, sir.
Do you have any thoughts or comments about plainclothes officers involved in street drug enforcement in terms of, should those officers be rotated over a period of years? Do you have the sense that if officers are performing that task for a period of many years, that they might lose sight of professionalism or get sucked into the darkness of the drug trade, if you will, just from spending their careers doing that sort of work?
I don't believe that that's the turning point for corruption, is because you worked in a unit for too long. We tried it. We had a rotation policy in the police department under a former administration. I think it was a 3-year minimum. And in certain areas of the department, homicide investigations, for instance, it takes years to learn how to conduct a proper homicide investigation. And when you, I think in any specialized unit, be it the SWAT team, it takes years to hone in your tactics and your skill set. So again, there's pros and cons to doing a rotation. And, I wouldn't take it off the table, so to speak. I just think it needs to be thought out instead of doing an ad hoc rotation policy.
During your career, were you, and I know you told us you had no knowledge of these GTTF officers engaged in misconduct. Did you have situations during your career where it came to your attention, either because you were part of the IA process or because of your role in the chain of command, that a certain officer had falsified information or planted evidence or stolen drug money?
Well, I never worked in internal affairs or oversaw internal affairs. I was on the operations side. At times, obviously, through my career, other officers have been indicted or under investigation by internal affairs. Generally, when ethics is involved, that's a direct report to the commissioner. So I wouldn't be aware of it. That would go through the Deputy Commissioner of Administration and directly to the Commissioner's office. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, and I guess it does. And I was trying to find out whether you had experience. You mentioned the defining moment, which led me to think of what was the defining moment for some of these officers where they crossed the line and decided they would put hands illegally on someone's drug money or steal from them or falsify an affidavit. And do you have any insight into what would lead an officer or a group of officers to basically go down that road?
Unfortunately, I don't have direct insight. It's sad when you read other stories, across the country with misconduct. You see officers that are dealing with personal issues most of the time that ultimately cause them to do that, whether it's a gambling habit or a divorce, or I don't know. I don't know the answers to this, but I think it's it's something that, again, could be a learning experience, particularly for first line supervisors and new recruits that are coming in to say, hey, these are some of the telltale signs that can lead to this behavior. So if you see these telltale signs, you might want to pay a little bit closer attention, or, and again, it's a little bit different now because officers who are dealing with personal issues now have an outlet for it that, didn't exist before. So the agencies across the country have done a phenomenal job at bringing in professional practitioners where officers could communicate their issues with them personally and confidentially.
You're referring to an early intervention system with an employee assistance program that helps officers who might have mental health, drinking issues, family issues, that sort of thing.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned supervision, and as you look back on how the GTTF officers were supervised, you mentioned location. So it's my understanding that Officer Jenkins' squad basically was out at the barn, wasn't physically supervised 100% of the time by their lieutenant. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir.
And I guess too, do you have concerns looking back about the span of control, for example, of what Lieutenant German's or another lieutenant's responsibilities are, and whether that lieutenant is just juggling too many things to be able to closely supervise a particular squad?
Yes, sir. Looking back, I do. And again, it boils down to your personnel strength, and again, the importance of retention, to reduce span of control, particularly in specialized units.
Is it accurate that basically Sergeant Jenkins' squad was allowed to roam free citywide as opposed to being assigned to a particular zone?
If I'm not mistaken, they had a geography that they would work. However, whatever they would develop, if they were developing a case and it took them to another part of the city, that they would have that authority to follow up. And then I guess when he became into the GTTF, they had more of a citywide reign. So the enforcement squads would be assigned to geographic locations, and then GTTF at the time was more of a citywide within those, but it was within those zones throughout the city.
When you were deputy commissioner, were there examples of officers committing overtime fraud?
There was, not that I recall specific cases, but our chief financial officer would often produce the overtime reports, and it would show who the top 10 earners were. I'm sure internal affairs may have been looking at some of that. I don't know firsthand. But overtime was evaluated. The issue with that is you didn't know what the overtime was until it was too late. So when the payroll closed and the budget report came out, there was no way to track it ahead of time. So we had discussed programs or methods that would flag an officer when they hit a certain amount of overtime. There's a written policy on what an officer should and should not exceed as far as daily overtime. But caveats came in about, well, secondary overtime is different. So if you work daily overtime but work a ball game at the stadium, would be calculated differently into your overtime hours, so to speak. But it was always after the fact that we would get these reports to be able to evaluate them.
In these officers' situation, we had incidents where they're at home working on their house, but saying that they're at work, putting in for overtime, or being out of town on vacation at a resort, but putting in for overtime. And based upon your sense of how the overtime system worked at the time you retired, it was part of the problem basically that it was a paper system with sergeants signing off for each other with regard to overtime without pre-approval?
Basically, yes, sir. So the other issue is if a patrol officer, for instance, who is assigned to the Eastern District were to work an overtime shift in the Western District, a Western District supervisor would sign his overtime slip, but the commanding officer at the Eastern District would not learn about the overtime hours worked from those officers until his budget report came out. So again, because there's different locator numbers throughout the police department of where officers work overtime, depending on where they are, they find a first line supervisor. Hey, we worked X amount of hours here, and they would have a supervisor sign the slip and submit it back to their command.
Mm-hmm.
So it is an antiquated paper system that, needs to be streamlined through technology.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk for a few minutes about the culture within the department. We have a situation with these GTTF officers where no one, it seems, ever spoke up about these officers. It may be that no one personally witnessed any of the criminal misconduct, but at the time you left the department, how would you assess the culture in terms of the willingness of the line officers to speak up if they saw another officer engaged in misconduct or using excessive force or not treating a civilian with decency and respect? What was your sense of the culture at the department?
There's cases where officers obviously have come forward on police misconduct. There's other avenues outside of the internal affairs system that officers can report things to. Personally, I didn't think it was a culture that if the officers saw something egregious that they would report it. I mean, that's what you hope for. Frankly, I didn't put a lot of thought into it at the time as to the culture of people not reporting stuff that they see to be bad behavior. A lot of times the supervisors' complaints that would come in, depending on how they would come in, would determine who they're investigated by, whether it's a frontline supervisor or all the way up to internal affairs ethics. So you kind of depended on the system to work in that capacity. So that's kind of my thoughts. So.
Were there situations where officers who reported misconduct were retaliated against, either by other officers or by their supervisors for having reported on another officer?
Not that I recall specifically.
At the time you left the department, do you think the culture was one of, if you see something, you'll say something about it, you'll speak up for the good of the department, as opposed to protecting your buddy who's your partner who's done something wrong?
I think so. You know, and that was stressed particularly again with the climate that we're in today, and under the reforms that we were working on while I was still there was to how do we restore trust in the community, and you know, be able to serve and protect and get along with our community members who live and work and play there, so to speak. So, you know, that reform was initiated while I was there, and it's obviously still moving in the right direction. So I think that culture would need to change, and the officers that are there at the time when I left, I believe would have done the right thing.
Mhm. One of the other things that Commissioner Harrison has mentioned publicly is a focus more on community policing rather than performance metrics, rather than numbers. Was it your sense that for most of your career that instead of issues of trust within the community and how best to prevent crime, that the focus was more on number of arrests or number of guns taken off the street?
I don't think, no, number of arrests, you know, particularly during the BFL administration, we were able to, the police department was able to decrease the number of arrests as well as decrease violent crime. The focus was always on violent crime and the emphasis on violent organizations. And, you know, we always said we weren't going to arrest our way out of that situation. So the focus was to identify key players using analysts to point us in the right direction, which we created areas to deploy officers to and hone in on the specific people responsible for those crimes. So it didn't become a numbers game. It wasn't a numbers game through that administration. And, you know, we reduced the amount of arrests while we were focusing on reducing the violent crime.
And then after Commissioner Bielefeld left, did there start to be more of a focus again on the numbers? Get X number of guns off the street or arrest X number of individuals?
No, again, the numbers speak for themselves. There was a reduction from the Bielefeld era down on the number of arrests that were made. There was a focus on violent repeat offenders and people that were known as trigger pullers or who were known to carry guns. So, you know, if you want to say the numbers were focused on guns, it was focused on guns that were being used in violent crimes.
I guess part of the reason why I'm asking that is whether, again, with the benefit of hindsight, whether someone like Officer Jenkins, who, as you say, had the reputation of a go-getter, was being praised for bringing in guns more regularly, it seems, than other officers, being active in street enforcement, whether his performance allowed him in any way to get away with his misbehavior. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think his performance allowed him to get away with his behavior. It obviously may have disguised his behavior, but I think with, you know, again, looking back at the internal affairs process, you know, should he have been on the radar? What were his complaints, you know, through internal affairs? I don't know those numbers, but so I don't think that that's true.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Palmier. Mr. Chairman, those were all the introductory questions that I had, and I'm sure our commissioners have questions for the witness as well.
Okay, does Megan have any follow-up or?
No, not at this time.
All right.
Your Honor, thank you.
Okay, great. We'll now open the floor to any questions by the commissioners. And let me just transparency and the need for legislative reform. And I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts with respect to those as this commission studies these things.
Your Honor, your link froze up on my side here. Could you repeat that, please?
Okay, let me try again. The commission testimony and comments about the lack of discipline and the lack of transparency and the need for legislative reform, such as the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights and that sort of thing. And I'm just did you hear me? Did you hear me?
No, sir. I lost you. I don't know if anybody else heard you, but I lost you on my link.
All right. Let me throw it to other commissioners, see if the other commissioners have any questions.
Mr. Chair, if I may. Commissioner Palmier, Sean Malone, I kind of wanted to go back through some of your testimony, and I thank you for your service to Baltimore and your family service. Just to make clear on the chain of command between Sergeant Jenkins, actually, how long did the Gun Trace Task Force serve under your command? How many years?
I believe it was incepted somewhere around 2007, 2008. I don't know. But again, for the majority of the time, I was assigned to investigations at an appointed rank. But then again, I had a few years where I was either chief of patrol or deputy commissioner of patrol or a district commander. So on and off from, I would say, about 2007, 8 when it incepted till when I retired.
And you retired in what year?
2018.
Okay. So I guess what's concerning is we've gone through this. Well, actually, let me just take a step back. As Deputy Commissioner of Operations, you were essentially the number 2 person in the agency, you and Deputy Commissioner of Administration. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
You direct report to the Commissioner. Okay. How often did you meet directly with Internal Affairs about would you have about 1,200 people under your command? Is that fair?
Times, yes, sir.
Okay. How often did you meet with Internal Affairs directly about your officers? Did you ever meet? Was it siloed? They did their thing, you did yours?
Yeah, I never met directly with the deputy commissioner regarding specific internal affairs cases. Again, that was a direct report to the commissioner from the deputy commissioner of admin.
Okay. And there were things, I mean, from your time in command that coming through the agency, such as a polygraph for an individual coming into a specialized unit. They had kind of the Freedom of the Gun Trace Task Force. You had the ability to implement that and didn't. Why? Why didn't you guys do that? Was that a decision of a commissioner above you, or you just didn't think about it, or?
No, we did make that recommendation, I believe, under 2 administrations to polygraph and do a written test. I don't recall the reason why it wasn't implemented, whether it was funding or just the need for polygraphers and recruitment or not at the time.
I mean, but the agencies during that whole time always had a polygrapher, didn't they?
A contractual one, yes, sir.
Okay, all right. And with regard to the background of individuals who were out, the IED background. You could check the IED background of any officer at any time as a deputy commissioner, couldn't you?
Um,
I mean, you could call down and say, give me the background of this guy's coming in the unit. Let me take a look at the number of complaints and sustained cases.
when we put out a posting for applicants to come into the unit,
Right.
the supervisors would vet those applicants. They would go through an interview process. They would develop a list of names of potential candidates that they would like to bring in. At times, those lists were sent to internal affairs to be vetted, and the response will come back that, basically nothing would preclude that person, or this person has an open violation, but it wasn't specific to that point.
Okay. So Sergeant Jenkins reported to what? Lieutenant German, is that right?
At some point in time, he did, yes, sir.
Okay. And who would German have reported to?
Either the major at the time, but then there was a point where we had a major's vacancy,
Okay.
so she would go directly to the colonel.
All right. And it would, if the lieutenant and if the lieutenant and the major were to say, look, this unit was under us on paper, but really directly reported to the deputy commissioner, would that be accurate or inaccurate?
That would be inaccurate.
Okay. So, I mean, is it fair to summarize your position as a deputy commissioner? You just didn't have day-to-day oversight over these guys and weren't aware of their activities?
Correct.
Okay. So when you looked at their stats, they were awfully good. I mean, they were turning out up numbers that were unlike other numbers that other groups had produced in the agency. Is that fair?
Again, without looking at the stats, I don't think they were out of skew, so to speak.
Okay. All right. So what we have consistently heard is that they were a very productive unit above and beyond what other units would be. That's not your recollection?
They were productive, but I didn't see it as being overly productive from other units. Certain other units, we had narcotic squads that were seizing large amounts of cocaine, but you didn't see that in patrol. So, I mean, it's all on how you, I guess, define it.
Yeah, but you wouldn't compare them to control. You would compare them to other specialized units. I mean, you had a long career. You were known as a very good operational officer. You knew the difference between a really productive unit and an unproductive unit. There were some, I mean, what numbers did you look at to determine whether these guys were out there working hard or whether they weren't working hard? You were looking at some metrics, weren't you?
We were looking at violence reduction in the zones and the VROs within the zones who were identified by the analysts, the violent organizations that were dismantled. So they were the metrics that we looked at. We weren't looking at day-to-day seizures.
Okay.
Or arrests.
And they were effective in the metrics you looked at. Okay.
To an extent.
So what concerns me, what concerns me is, and we've heard this as well from an administration that follows you. So this group results in it's probably the biggest scandal in the Baltimore Police Department during your tenure, right? The most indictments, the most federal criminal convictions, the most scorn cast on this department came as a result of these. We have not seen a criminal enterprise in this agency during your career, which spanned over 20 years, right?
Correct.
Okay. And this happens directly under your command, albeit there are ranks between you. Only one member of command staff is demoted. The major did nothing wrong. The captain did nothing wrong. The lieutenant did nothing wrong that you thought as the head of the agency, somebody wasn't providing proper supervision as sergeant? Only one person merited a demotion?
Again, that was all part of an internal investigation that was taking place. The commissioner opted at the time to demote the colonel that was there.
Did that not raise questions on your end as the number 2 guy in the department? But wait a minute, we're demoting the colonel, but what was the major? There was more direct supervision of Sergeant Jenkins than the colonel. I mean, I guess I'm confused in the gap. Why would the colonel be held responsible and not you or anybody between the sergeant and the colonel? Was it determined that the sergeant reported around the chain of command?
No, again, to my knowledge, there was still an ongoing internal investigation that was taking place. So, as you know, you can't merely go ahead and demote a lieutenant. And frankly, the captain. I think there are different majors there at the time, and then there was a vacancy for some period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some transitioning taking place, and during this time again. Although I was there the majority of the time, there were several years where I wasn't part of that. I was solely in patrol. So, when you look at it, that's a question for the commissioner at the time is where, what accountability do you continue or do you let the internal investigation take place?
Does it surprise you that no one's been disciplined in the agency other than the officers that the feds got and this one demotion of a colonel?
Again, I don't know what else is taking place or it took place with the internal investigation if it's still open.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Well, and with the biggest scandal in the history of the agency happening within your chain, wouldn't it have been prudent to do some after action report? Didn't you want some answers if you don't know how the problem was solved, how do we correct it going forward?
I absolutely agree, that there needs to be an after action report done. So.
But you had that ability. Were you told not to do it? Did you decide not to do it, or is it just you didn't have enough time before you left to do it?
Well, it was, I wasn't asked not to do it.
Right.
At the time, I didn't really think about it because you're handling other day-to-day operations and, the investigation was still pending, so to speak. And, so in hindsight, I absolutely would have pushed for it.
Did you make any changes in your operations to try to prevent something like this from happening? I mean, I've heard the bit about early intervention systems, not just you, Deputy Commissioner, that these are expensive, and there are programs that are expensive, but you certainly had the capacity to pull the complaint records of any officer and recommend them for additional training. I mean, that was done during your tenure in the agency in about 2003, 2004. Did you ever remove an officer for additional training based on citizen complaints? Or was that just not a venue you felt was open to you?
Again, you relied on the Administrative Bureau and Internal Affairs to, and that's the way the process was set up before. It was on the administrative side of the house. And I'm not pushing responsibility, so to speak, but that's just how it was set up initially, that these officers would be pulled in for early intervention training. And I think we're talking about the same time period. So, yeah, I mean, it's, again, not shrugging the responsibility of it, but it was set up to where that was vetted by the administrative side or internal affairs side.
I mean, as you're looking at police organizations and you had a long distinguished career, in looking at organizations, are police organizations set up for these type of failings because they're siloed? You're focused on operations and integrity is focused in internal affairs, and there's not much communication. Do you think that causes a problem? I mean, you wouldn't have tolerated this if you knew it. I have no doubt about that. And I have no doubt you didn't know that there were crimes going on. But I guess if there's no communication between internal affairs and operations at any point, and operations doesn't see it as its responsibility to recommend people for additional training, do you see that as a flaw in a structural flaw that should be repaired?
Yes, absolutely. It's, again, and then how administrations change dictates on ultimately how internal affairs operates, right? So I think, in a sense, you are working in a silo. I understand the thought behind it that, this is a direct report to the commissioner to keep the confidentiality of the investigation and not expose, particularly with the ethics side of it, to not have that throughout the department. But on the offside, when, you know, you send over a list of names and only, you know, they're not properly vetted, that part I don't fully understand. And I think for general complaints or red flags, again, is where the technology piece comes in, to be able to flag these officers moving forward. And I think a lot of agencies are looking at those options, not just in Baltimore.
Commissioner, is it unusual for a sergeant to have regular direct communication with the deputy commissioner or a colonel outside the chain of command?
Is it unusual?
Yeah. Shouldn't they be communicating through the chain of command as opposed to around it?
Well, it depends. Yeah, I mean, technically there's a chain of command, but if, you know, deputy commissioner or a colonel or a major sees an officer in the high, you know, in a station house and has small talk with them, I mean, that's
That's
not.
why I'm not talking. I'm talking about operational decisions. I mean, so what we've been indicating is that this Sergeant Jenkins was able to go outside his direct supervisors and go above them into the agency to ask for things. And I think there are emails directly or text messages directly from Jenkins to you. Did you do that with a lot of sergeants? Were there a lot of sergeants you maintained contact with, or would that have been unusual? Or did that just not take place in your recollection?
I don't recall any text messages
Okay.
with Jenkins. So
Okay. Or emails or phone calls? That just he wasn't a guy you communicated with regularly.
I don't recall, no. Not communicating with him directly on a regular basis, no.
When this story broke, did you talk to his immediate supervisor, say, what's going on? How could this have happened? This is a horrific embarrassment.
I think everybody was shocked when it happened.
Not everybody who oversaw the bureau, you did, and I'm just wondering, and the commissioner obviously as well. But I'm just wondering, I mean, did you talk down the chain and say, hey, what do you guys know? What's going on here? Or did you think that was more the purview of the investigators at that time?
I don't recall talking directly to anyone in reference. Again, it was still an ongoing investigation. And, you know, I think Jason Johnson was the deputy commissioner on the administrative side at the time, who oversaw internal affairs. And, you know, as I understood it, he was, you know, briefing the commissioner on the investigation. So you kind of, you know, in retrospect, in hindsight, you know, maybe you should ask the questions, but at the time you relied on that side of the house to do the investigation.
Sure. And Commissioner, I mean, of that command, of Davis and Johnson and you, I mean, no one had the institutional knowledge that you brought to the table as a deputy commissioner. You knew personnel and their histories much better than anybody else. I mean, Davis had been there a year and a half, 2 years. Johnson came in with him. Was there anybody else in command that had your knowledge of the agency? I mean, you knew who good cops were, who productive cops were, who were question marks from your 20-some years of service, right?
Well, I knew some of the officers. I didn't know all of the officers. I mean, there was, you know, up to 3,000 officers there.
But there weren't 3,000 in this unit. How many did you know in this unit?
I knew several of them, who they were by name and face. There's others that I didn't know. I wouldn't have known them if I walked past them.
Okay. Who put this unit together, selected this group? Was the lieutenant able to pick their guys? Was the sergeant able to pick their guys? The captain? Who was able to do that?
Yeah, so generally it would be the sergeant and the lieutenant who would select the names, and then they would be forwarded up the chain for approval.
Okay. And there was no concern with obviously the personnel that was selected. After this was done, though, it would seem to me if you said, Malone, you pick your team and your team ends up being criminal, you want to hold me accountable. You had the ability to transfer anybody in the chain of command you wanted. You're right, you can't demote a lieutenant, but you can certainly put them in another position. Was anybody in the chain of command transferred out of their responsibilities as a result of this that you know of? Was there anybody you had concern with to say, man, this shouldn't have happened, you got to go?
Not that I recall at the time.
Okay. And getting back to kind of the point, my one point about the communication, you certainly had the history of the agency, in retrospect, you think it's a mistake of the commissioner to not rely on guys who've been there longer? I mean, you had the ability to reach out to people and find and make some phone calls to find out a background on some of these guys. I mean, your contacts in the agency were much deeper than the commissioner or Johnson's. That's fair to say, right? I mean, you've been there 20 years.
I don't think that's fair to say. When
Wait,
when you're talking about the reaching out to who?
wait a minute, Commissioner, you can't really say that within 2 to 3 years, Commissioner Davis had the contacts and the knowledge and the relationships that you had within that agency over the course of what your 20-some year career, right? I
Oh,
mean, how
correct.
can that? Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
And so I'm just saying structurally then for an outside commissioner, would it be advisable for him to lean on you to say, Dean, what's the background on these guys? What's the story here? What do you know? I mean, freezing you out of the process, not involving you in the process.
right.
I mean, aren't they kind of operating in the blind then?
No, there would be times where the commissioner would say, he would ask not only me, but other commanders
Sure.
that were there during their career. I'm sorry, I misunderstood what you had said earlier.
It's okay. That's fair. Okay. Integrity stings. I mean, so you were supervising unit on the street, producing decent numbers anyways. We weren't doing polygraphs. We weren't doing integrity stings. We didn't have an early intervention program in place. I understand that wasn't directly your call for some of that. But was there anything that you were doing to test the integrity or check the integrity, or were we just hoping that these were good officers doing their sworn duty? And going forward, is hope enough? I mean, do we need to trust but also verify? Would you take responsibility and say, hey, look, this was a mistake in the Operations Bureau. We could have done more to vet these guys coming in and to check them as they went on. Or do you think that still should be the responsibility of internal affairs?
No, I mean, I believe in trust but verify. And, as I stated, there were times, where we discussed polygraph processes at the on-site, and we always had the random UR analysis, but we never had the random polygraph. So in hindsight, you absolutely, I mean, you would want to do things differently.
And Commissioner, this is a pretty direct question. It's a kind of a tough question, but where did you fail here? I mean, or did you not fail? Did the failure happen down the line? But where, looking back to 2007 or 8, if you were going to do something differently, would you become a stronger advocate to get integrity stings, to do polygraphs, to do an early intervention program? I mean, in essence, you had a command out there within your chain of command. You had an unverified group policing and committing crimes. And the way it was structured, there really was, according to what I'm hearing from you, there was no way for you to know. The colonel saying there was no way for him to know. Lieutenant saying they were going around us anyways. How would you restructure this based on what you now know and your years of experience to ensure this kind of thing didn't go forward? And that's really what we're trying to get to. I'm not trying to say, Commissioner, you're at fault here, but I am saying, like, how do we learn and make recommendations to this agency to ensure that this type of failure, and ultimately as the number 2 guy in the agency and the commissioner, you guys have some responsibility, I would think. Because we're not finding anyone in the chain of command who's saying, yeah, this was a mistake. This was, and it couldn't have been undetectable. I mean, we just weren't doing some things to check, I would imagine. The feds figured it out.
Yeah, I think in hindsight, when you look at the structure of how the division was set up, I mentioned several things earlier with the chain of command, your span of control in the chain of command. Having commanding officers, strong commanding officers, not just one, but 2 to 3, one that could handle the task force side of this, one that can handle the enforcement side. Both, at the time it was East and West. So, when in the perfect world, will we have done things differently and beefed up your span of control, your supervision? Absolutely. Will we had off-site locations that were unchecked? No. I mean, but some of these guys were working out of district station houses, and there was discussions would they fall under the district commander's chain of command, or is it better to keep them under one umbrella as a division? So those discussions did occur. And then the ultimate decisions were made that they would remain under one command, but work decentralized. So there's things that in hindsight, we absolutely, could have done differently. But in reality, you're looking at your resources and things of that nature. So I think, we all take responsibility for it.
Would you have been, and just, in fact, would you think you would have been a better commander had you spent some time in internal affairs?
I
no?
think I would have been, yeah, I mean, I think, the more knowledge, you could have as in any profession, the more knowledge you have in that profession, it's going to make you a better, smarter person. And the fact that, the intricate inner workings of the agency and not just in one field, so to speak. So, yeah, I mean, and I know there's other departments that, have, in order to get promoted, you had to spend a time in internal affairs to do it. Makes sense.
In a long distinguished career where you accomplished a lot and did a lot of great things for this agency and the city, this thing's probably got to be the biggest concern for you, I would imagine, right? Causes you the most heartburn.
Mr. Malone, it's something that bothers me every day. And,
I understand.
Again, this is what, again, I take a lot of pride in my career and what we did and in policing. And it does, it's not how I wanted my legacy or a family legacy to end. And again, it's tragic of what these guys did.
And fair enough. And sir, do you think if we could turn the clock back, would you have been a stronger advocate for polygraphing these guys before they got in and while they're in? Would you have been a stronger advocate for doing integrity stings? And would you have been a stronger advocate for early intervention to pull guys off the street for retraining?
Absolutely.
Okay, I don't have anything else. Commissioner, I really do thank you. And I don't want to understate the commitment that you've shown to the city and what your family's done for the agency. And I appreciate you answering my questions honestly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Commissioner, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. How are you today?
Commissioner?
I had
Yes. Go ahead.
I had some more questions, but Mr. Malone, being the lawyer of the group, was on for quite a while. Deputy, can we go back to your discussion about the FBI and who knew what and when? As Deputy Commissioner, did you supervise the task force officers assigned to our federal partners or assigned to your federal partners?
They were under my chain of command. The federal HIDA task force groups?
Either the HIDA task force group, or I assume you had people assigned to the FBI corruption group?
No, there was an FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, which fell under Intel, but the ethics reported directly to the internal affairs side.
So you would not get regular briefings from that group?
No.
To your knowledge, did they report to the commissioner at all?
I don't know if they reported directly to the commissioner or to the the deputy commissioner of admin at the time. I don't know.
And I know you were asked a question. I got kind of two different answers. At what point did you know that the department knew that this case was coming down or was being investigated?
I believe it was several days before before the indictments, when Commissioner Davis told me that there were pending indictments for, he didn't tell me the names or who, just that there was pending indictments for several officers in my chain of command.
So that would have been several days before.
Yes, sir.
They were
From what I
arrested.
recall.
Okay. switching back to the chain of command issue we talked about. Mr. Malone's correct. These guys were really productive. I mean, I've seen numbers where they might have accounted to 20 to 25% of the gun seizures.
Mhm.
Not necessarily the arrest, but the gun seizures. There's been a lot of testimony in front of this committee or this commission that people were willing to look the other way because they were simply getting the numbers. Your thoughts on that? Anywhere in the chain?
I look the other way. I mean, to my knowledge, no, I wasn't aware. It wasn't about a look the other way for me personally. So, and I don't define look the other way. I don't know what they're referencing, that they would just.
So, I mean, you and I grew up in the same kind of career path, a lot of narcotics, a lot of
Right.
street work. Somebody's getting you the numbers that you want to see. Okay. You have a shooting in the Eastern on 321 post, and this group will go out and get us a couple guns out of 321 post. Right?
Correct.
We don't ask how they did it, how they were able to get in there in a couple hours, grab us a couple guns. But they did it. So, the accusation is, or the assumption on some people's part is, no one asked because they didn't want to know. Why this group, these 6, 7 people at the time, I know it grew into more, why this group was so good at what they did that it couldn't be replicated anywhere else amongst, patrol or anybody in a specialized unit, that this group was so good at it that people were simply saying, you know what, we don't want to know how they're doing it, but they're getting us the numbers.
That's
That's
not
my
how-
definition of it.
I'm sorry.
That's my definition of look the other way.
Yeah. So I understand what you're saying. And again, our metrics, we got out of the I guess the 90s era, and reduced the amount of arrests. And we were focusing at the time on violent repeat offenders and violent organizations, for the majority, I guess, of their time, that they were doing these acts. So it wasn't I didn't perceive it as a look the other way numbers game. I perceived it as, who was arrested? What is his background? Is he part of an organization? That was more of how I would measure things.
So the command did look at not only, I want to say the quantity of arrests, but the quality of the arrest?
For ComStat, during the ComStat sessions, yeah, I mean, you've attended them, so it was more about the intel and the knowledge. I mean, we put a lot of investment into the Intel Center, or the Watch Center, to identify individuals. So those are kind of the metrics that we were looking at.
Did the trigger puller list that you worked off of, was that at some point done away with?
I don't think so while I was there. I don't know if it's been done away with since.
Okay. And I'll circle back around to my last question, is we've had testimony in front of the commission that members of the unit, particularly Sergeant Jenkins, would receive direction directly from you on the night of a homicide or the night of a shooting to go into a certain area. Would that be a correct statement on someone's part?
I don't recall having direct conversation with him, giving him direction. I've may have communicated to his colonel, hey, we want to put additional resources in this particular area. So, let's beef up our resources there. A district commander may say, hey, I'm getting my tail kicked in this particular area. I need some resources, and the resources would be sent there. So, I don't recall specifically communicating with Wayne Jenkins saying, hey, I need you here. Whether or not it was in a ComStat session or elsewhere, but those conversations happen quite often where you reallocate resources.
And I want to echo Mr. Malone's comments. We worked together briefly, and I know your family, and thank you for you and your family's service to the citizens of Baltimore.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Is there another question?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah, this is Inez. I have a couple quick questions. Hi, Deputy Palmer.
How are you?
Two quick questions. If okay, doing good. From community standpoint, I would like to ask you if what would you do to make community and policing relationship or community policing better? That's the first question. The second question is how, if you had to change or make the communications process for the police department, what would it be like so that everybody would be in the loop? Thank you. I'm gonna shut up and hear what you have to say.
So to answer your first question, Ms. Robb, I would certainly seek more people that are as committed as you are in the community. So you do a lot for West Baltimore. And I think bringing in more of the grassroots organizations and involving them or including them into the police department. And we started doing this at a caliber where we started the Citizens Academy. We had the commissioners' monthly community relations council presidents meetings in the boardroom, as you're aware of. But I think some of these things that we're doing or were doing at the time just need to be built and expanded upon. But as you include more of the community organizations or representatives of community organizations into the police department, an important piece is educating and training our community members as well to understand the inner workings of a police department, how it was operating in a very antiquated capacity for a 21st century police department, and what is being done to build the technology to make the police department not only more efficient, but reliable and have the community impact of that. And when certain members of the community can see progress there and share that with other community stakeholders, ultimately, I would hope that would begin to restore some of the trust with the agency. And then, of course, we always talked about transparency and the importance of transparency, not only in certain incidents, but how quick things become transparent. So not to let rumors or stories linger until a statement's made.
okay. Thank you.
And
You asked another question.
the other question was the one about communications process. What would you do as far as the police department so that everybody would be in the loop?
Yeah, I think the police department has made great strides in electronic communication and using the technology of computers to message things out. But, we all know that not everybody has access to technology. So opening these district stations to, have maybe a community center within the station to share information, obviously, as the police department can build its staff up, you certainly want to see the footmen out there that can share information in the communities, and the community relations officers that can be out sharing that information. But there's no one answer to that. I think keeping the technology piece going, social media is a big thing with sharing information. But for those that are not fortunate enough to be able to either use social media or have access to it, you have to do some more traditional and conventional means of information sharing.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor. Your Honor.
I think you might be frozen. So you're on mute now.
Is there another question?
Yes, sir.
All right, next question.
Okay. This is Commissioner Jim Roby. I won't be long because there's other two gentlemen ahead of me ate up everybody's time, but we're used to that, so I'll deal with it. Commissioner, I just want to, I understand from my position, I started in 66 as a police officer and moved through the different ranks to become chief. And I know, at least it seemed to me, the further you move away from the front line, the higher you go in the pecking order, the less you're going to hear about what's going on the street. And I know it's very, very difficult to keep track of that. So I'm just wondering, what would you suggest as a way of reaching down into the system? More meetings with the majors, the captains, lieutenants, or how do you get them to understand they've got to get closer to the ground and relay to you what's happening on the street back up to you?
So I think having your boots on the ground on the street, you're definitely going to hear more information. We tried a few different options with that. We would have a quarterly program where officers who were selected by their commanding officers could come into the commissioner's boardroom and, who were selected, again, whether it was community related or activities by a district commander, to come in and kind of have a sit down with the commissioner and the deputies. And, they were selected because they were doing well in their current assignments. And we offered them an ability to kind of open up and share information. And oftentimes it would be about, equipment or uniforms or things of that nature. So whether they were just hesitant to share more information, I presume. And then we were given an opportunity to detail them to an assignment that they would request, whether it would be Regional Auto Theft Task Force or Warrant Apprehension Task Force or the Homicide Unit for a 30-day period. And it was kind of like an incentive to, or morale booster, I would say. But, to get back to the root of your question, I think more meetings with boots on the ground and having a forum or an open dialogue, setting up, mini commissions within the agency to kind of spearhead projects. We did some of that, but we just never saw things that were tangible. Small things we could do, but it's a tough question. So
Yes, I realize that. Let me ask you this. I know it's very difficult for you to get close enough, not socially, but professionally, to the officers and get information from them. Because if you went to the sergeants on the street in this particular case, you think they would have told you what they were doing? Heck no. All right. So if the lieutenant would have, how could she have more closely monitored what was going on to determine there was something not right?
So I think, if you're as a frontline supervisor, I guess you see, the guys made a amount of overtime and, they were on vacation, that would obviously be a clue. But I think being more involved with the squads. And again, I don't have the perfect answer for the lieutenants there at the time, because oftentimes these lieutenants were within headquarters or attending other meetings when the officers were working at all site locations. So I think, again, that span of control and having more daily contact from a lieutenant's perspective, would have at least maybe alerted them of what was going on.
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make. As far as she was removed from them with all the other responsibilities, she wasn't close to them professionally to really get a feel. I mean, yes, she could have checked the overtime. Did she ever check the overtime? I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. Two other questions for you. Did you go through a supervisor training when you became a sergeant?
I don't recall sergeant. We didn't, to my knowledge, I don't recall sergeant school at the time. They have one now, or they had one when I left.
I know when I was promoted to sergeant, Maryland Police Training Commission had a supervisor school for a week, and we had to attend. So I did get some idea about ethics and what you could expect from subordinates under you and what you have to look out for. The other question is, have you gone through ethics training?
Yes.
So you received the same thing the officers have received or will be receiving?
I actually took an ethics class in the FBI NA Academy. Formerly at the police department, we had an ethics course in our academy training, but I don't recall the curriculum or how involved it was.
Are you a graduate of NA?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What session?
214th, I believe.
That's a little further down the road than 116, it looks like to me.
Yes, sir.
No, that's all. I think we're getting closer to time anyway. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I appreciate your participation today.
Yes, sir.
All right, Commissioners Wilson or Parker?
Yeah. Yes, I have a question. What
Either.
does it mean? First of all, good afternoon. Sorry
Hi.
about that. What does it mean to supervise within the police department? I'm like, what level, what does it mean to be a supervisor or to supervise one's work?
So from a sergeant's standpoint, you're basically the day-to-day supervisor or overseer of a squad of people. You know, span of controls 5 to 7, it could vary at times. But the responsibilities of a first line supervisor is the daily communication with their officers, as far as roll call aspects, reports, crime reports that might have come in from the night before, apprising them of, you know, what the day's mission is, so to speak, but also accounting for their reports that are required, any delinquent reports that may be required, their overtime, maintenance of their fleet vehicles, not the maintenance of them, but, you know, if they're in service or out of service type of things. And then just day-to-day contact. Some sergeants choose to ride with an officer in their squad or rotate through officers in their squad. Some choose to be solo in the field and show up at calls for service. So daily guidance would be for a sergeant. Lieutenant, a little bit different, and then up the chain, it gets a little more administrative.
Okay. And am I correct in saying that you supervise this group through their being in different units? It looked like you were in the chain of command of some or all of the individuals at some point during their tenure with the Baltimore City Police Department.
Yeah, it would have been from, well, there was a couple of the detectives, I believe, when I became a lieutenant in the fast unit that had worked in that unit at the time. And then when I became deputy major, and then the organization was restructured a bit, and the organized crime division developed. I don't, again, without going back to personnel jacks, I knew some of the officers were working in the organized crime division at that time too. So, you know, several ranks removed from where they were, but they did fall under, I guess, my umbrella, you would say.
And at no point during your supervision of them were there red flags raised to you?
No, unfortunately, not that I recall, you know.
Okay. And the reports and the statistics that they were able to achieve, did that seem out of whack with what others were achieving in the department?
You know, when you go back through the years and it's not like we looked at their arrest every day. We would see the emails that would come out periodically, but in hindsight, you know, would we have questioned possibly? But again, I'd have to look at the numbers again and take a look at them. But through the years, I mean, there were squads that would perform, you know, in high crime areas. You know, when you have a city with, you know, over 300 murders, what do we have, 50 shootings in a week? There's obviously going to be people carrying guns on the streets. So when you see the ebbs and flows of gun violence. And, you know, if you see more gun arrests at that time, kind of makes sense. But then if violence is down and you see less, that kind of makes sense. So I guess that's the way I was looking at it versus, you know, are they doing this in a corrupt way type of thing?
And there's one individual in particular I noticed that moved with you, Sergeant Alairs.
Yes.
What was his? He was once in the gun trace task force and then was moved at some point.
Again, I don't know the timeline. I believe when I took over as colonel, Allers was in the administrative office, along with a lieutenant and another officer. And he did go to the gun trace task force at some point, and he was promoted, and then went back to a district for a while, and then I believe came back into the task force group. But I can't recall the timeline. I'd have to look at the staffing charts to recall exactly how when the timeline was.
Okay. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Anything else?
Nothing further for me, Your Honor.
It seems like Judge is frozen. I know he's going to ask me, do I have a question?
All right.
No further
Yes.
questions. Thank you for joining, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you.
Okay. Questions of Deputy Commissioner Premier? All right, Mr. Deputy Commissioner, thank you so much for joining with us today, and your conversation and your testimony was very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Have a good evening.
To the next. Matt, when is our next meeting? It's the 28th?
Yes, you're currently on the calendar for September 28th at 2 o'clock again.
All right. Any more business this afternoon?
Mr. Chair, if we could, I know we're scheduled.
All right.
Sir, I know we're scheduled the 28th. Which is about 2 more weeks or so. I would ask the commission if we could meet in between. I think we have recommendations for consideration. And I know that there have been, we have 2 sets, LEOBR changes, as well as a list of significant reforms. I think Mr. McInerney can walk us through. Can we have an interim meeting in between then and now, as we were limited to 2 hours today, to try to get that off our agenda and move forward?
Let me throw that out. How are your schedules for next Monday, the 21st, about this time? Anytime on or about this time, next Monday?
I'll certainly make it work.
I only have 1 hour from 2 to 3.
Anyone else?
Jim Roby's okay for the whole time.
I'm okay.
All right. So Matt, it looks like we can get a quorum for next Monday. And let's continue our discussion on the recommendations for next Monday. Is 2 o'clock okay?
Since Commissioner Parker said she only would have an hour from 2 to 3, we could possibly start it a little bit earlier at 1 o'clock. There is nothing on the MGA calendar that day.
Commissioner Parker, does that help you if we start at 1?
I can do 1:30 to 3.
Okay.
1:30 to 3?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we do that? 1:30 to 3.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right, so Matt, you'll send us notice?
I'll send out notice and put it up on the calendar.
Okay, all right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.